Nixon and Watergate. This is a photograph of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had been a long-time politician. He had been a U.S. vice president, and he had ran against John F. Kennedy for president in the early 1960s. LBJ had taken over for John F. Kennedy after his assassination and then was elected in his own right as president. But LBJ decided not to seek re-election, in part because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War. It had really plagued his administration and overshadowed his war against poverty and his Great Society program. So this left the field wide open for other candidates. Ultimately, Hubert Humphrey will become the Democratic nominee, thanks in part, unfortunately, to the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Richard Nixon will become the Republican nominee. So it will be Richard Nixon versus Hubert Humphrey. Part of what Kennedy ran on during the presidential election was the Vietnam War. The unpopularity of the Vietnam War was really tied to LBJ and the Democratic Party. So Nixon will tie the unpopularity of the war to Hubert Humphrey. In other words, blaming the Democrats for this war that the American people no longer wanted. In fact, it came out recently that Nixon had worked against peace in the Vietnam War. LBJ had worked to establish peace talks between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and actually had achieved that. He had them both coming to the table. Nixon knew about this because LBJ told him. And the reason LBJ told him is because presidential candidates are entitled to specific classified information. So Nixon knew about it. But if there was peace in Vietnam, that would look favorably on the Democratic Party. So it wasn't in Nixon's best interest for the election for there to be peace in Vietnam. So Nixon and his team actively worked against LBJ's administration. In fact, they will collude or conspire, or however you want to say it, with the leadership in South Vietnam and encourage them not to go to the peace talks. That if he were elected president, that he could help them out. None of this really came out until recently because LBJ found out about all of this, didn't want to bring it up before the elections, didn't want to influence the elections, so he kept quiet and basically buried the whole thing. He actually had members of Nixon's team on CIA surveillance. But he buried all of this in what he called the X-Files, and it wasn't to be opened for 50 years, and it was just recently opened. So Nixon was kind of known as a dirty trickster. He played very nasty politics. But In the end, the peace talks didn't happen, and Nixon won. Now, he won for other reasons as well, but he ended up winning the Republican nomination and then, of course, the presidency. Like LBJ, Nixon inherited the Vietnam War. So it will begin to plague his administration as well. Nixon comes up with a plan called Peace with Honor, meaning he ultimately wanted to get the U.S. out of Vietnam, but he had to do it carefully. Because after all, the U.S. had spent a long time in the war, thousands of people had died, the U.S. government had spent a lot of money, the U.S. had never lost a war, so he had to figure out how to get the U.S. out of the war without making us look bad to the rest of the world. One of the soon-to-be many scandals during Nixon's administration was uh, the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers was a report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Task Force. So what had happened was Robert McNamara, who had been part of the U.S. Department of Defense, had ordered a study of the history of the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967. And his intent of this study was to leave a record for historians, future leaders, future administrators of what happened during the war, both the mistakes and the successes. And one of the analysts on that study ended up leaking that study to the American people. His name was Daniel Eisenberg. And what this study showed was the extent of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Most Americans didn't know, first of all, how long the U.S. had been involved in Vietnam. They weren't aware of bombings in Cambodia and Laos that the U.S. administrated, or raids in North Vietnam, because none of that was told to the American people by LBJ. In fact, LBJ had said the opposite and had really lied about some aspects of the Vietnam War. So this was a major scandal. It was first published by the New York Times, and then the entire Pentagon Papers was published with the Washington Post, and there was a big court case over it because Nixon tried to have it stopped because he claimed that it was classified information. Long story short, the Post won that court case. So this really made the U.S. government look bad, that the American people had been lied to about this war that they already hated. So this would be a major problem for Nixon. He will try to get dirt on Daniel Eisenberg, to get him indicted, to discredit him, all of those things, which really, in the end, didn't work. Another scandal, and probably the biggest scandal that happens during Nixon's administration, was the Watergate scandal. In 1972, Nixon was running for re-election, and he had an organization, or it's called CREEP, or the Committee to Re-elect the President, to help him get re-elected. Nixon orders the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. He ordered the break-in of the Democratic National Committee office. So what happened was, I believe it was 5 burglars broke into the DNC office, and they were to set up wiretaps. Well, the first time they did it, the break-in went in successfully, but the wiretaps weren't working, so they had to go back. And it's the second time that they broke in is when they got caught. And so first it really started out as this back page story about a break-in of the DNC. But then it became a much bigger story. The people that had really ran this operation was a group called the Plumbers. They were basically Nixon's security team. After the leak in the Pentagon Papers, Nixon didn't really trust people. He didn't trust the FBI. He didn't trust the CIA. So he ordered his own security team outside of the purview of FBI and the CIA. So the Plumbers are the one who really kind of set this in motion, as well as the committee to reelect the president. So all of them were involved. So what happens is Woodward and Bernstein, who were 2 Washington Post reporters, uh, start to really investigate this burglary and start to put pressure on the administration. They're publishing articles. Uh, they figure out the ties uh, to at least members of his administration, and they get a really good source from the It turns out it was from the FBI, one of the FBI in the FBI leadership, that became known as Deep Throat. And he was known as Deep Throat because he was a smoker and he used to meet Woodward in this parking garage, and it was really a really secretive affair. There was a movie made about it called All the President's Men. It's very good account of what happened. If you're ever interested in watching that, or if you haven't seen it, you should. It's pretty good account of it. It's based off a book that Woodward and Bernstein wrote. So ultimately, Nixon is found out. And part of the reason he's found out is because of tapes that he had in the Oval Office. Nixon was so paranoid that he installed a, a recording machine, not a machine, but a recording system where that recorded conversations. He started, firing people. Fired the special counsel that was investigating him. There was a Watergate commission that was really public. His vice president had just had to resign because he had problems of his own, because he had been investigated for bribery schemes. I mean, it was just a very corrupt administration, at least part of it was. So in the end, Nixon is forced to resign because after the tapes are released, and it really shows that Nixon was involved in the ordering of the break-in of the DNC headquarters. And he fought that the whole way. They tried to keep the tapes out. Ultimately, the courts ruled that those tapes could be released. And so Nixon had to resign. Now but by the time Watergate came to fruition and all of this was found out, it started in his first administration. ended up spilling into his second administration, because he was reelected, but he was reelected before a lot of the information about Watergate had come out. So partway through his second administration, Nixon resigns. And because he no longer had a vice president, Gerald Ford ended up taking over as president. He was, I believe, the Speaker of the House, which is very rare he was in the line of succession, but every time somebody resigned, one moved up. So um, he ended up moving up to the presidency. Ultimately, Gerald Ford did, and Gerald Ford was never really elected to office in his own right. So that's Nixon and Watergate. If you have any questions, please let me know.